Hello. Indirect taxation is taxation on expenditure, when you buy something and you pay a tax. That's what I want to look at in this diagram. I'll show you how indirect taxation is portrayed on a diagram, and also to show you how to calculate which part of the tax is paid by the consumers and which part is paid by producers, and why sometimes one of those two groups ends up paying more tax than the other. Well, we start off with a simple demand curve and supply curve. We have an equilibrium price, P1, and quantity, Q1. Now, when an indirect tax is imposed, it could be either a unit or specific tax, or it could be an ad valorem tax. We'll come to ad valorem soon, but let's first look at specific taxes. A specific tax is the same monetary value of tax regardless of the price. It could be a £2 tax on bottles of wine, whatever the quality and price of the wine. All bottles would have a £2 tax on them. That would be an example of a unit tax. Excise duties are a real example of unit taxes. And on a diagram, this would have the impact of shifting the S-curve upwards by a vertical distance equal to the tax. A vertical distance on the P-axis equal to the tax. It will shift a vertical distance equal to the tax. So let's imagine this S-curve shifting upwards. That's S2, that's with the tax, and as you can see, it's a parallel shift. With a unit tax or specific tax, it is a parallel shift upwards. It adds to the costs of production effectively, because it's the producer's responsibility to pay, to make sure the tax gets paid. Look what happens. The equilibrium price now has risen from P1 to P2, and as there's been a rise in price, there's been a fall in the quantity demanded as we've moved from this point to this point along the demand curve. Well, the price has risen, but the price has not risen by an amount equal to the actual tax, because, as I said before, the supply curve shifted upwards by a vertical distance equal to the tax, but the price has only gone up P1, P2, which shows us that the consumers are not paying all the tax. The producers are not able to pass on to the consumers all the tax. So, how do we calculate which proportion is paid by producers and consumers? This is what we do. We go to the new equilibrium point, which is here. We observe that the vertical distance between the supply curves at this point, in other words, this distance, which is the vertical distance between the supply curves at the new equilibrium point, is the tax per unit. That's the tax per unit, multiplied by the number of units being sold, which is OQ2, and that'll give us the total amount of tax. So, the vertical distance between the supply curves at the new equilibrium point is the tax per unit, times the number of units gives us the entire quantity of tax revenue for the government, this rectangle, which is the tax per unit times the number of units. But we observe also that the consumers have only seen a price rise from P1 to P2, which implies that this part of that entire tax revenue is paid by the consumers. This is paid by the consumers. That's the burden or incidence of tax on the consumers, levied on the consumers. Whereas this area must be being paid by producers. It's the remainder of the tax. The consumers are not paying it. It must be the producers paying it. So this area is, I'll just write it in, is paid by the producers. This area here. And together with what the consumers and the producers pay, that's the entire tax revenue for the government. Now, who pays the most of the tax, the consumers or the producers, depends upon the relative elasticities of the demand and the supply curve. If the demand curve was very inelastic and steep, we would expect the consumers, they wouldn't be responsive to price changes, and it would be easier for the producers to shift the tax burden to the consumers who are less sensitive to price. So when the demand curve is very inelastic compared to the supply, it's easier for the producers to avoid paying the tax and pass on the tax as a large price rise to the consumers. Conversely, when the supply is very inelastic, or when the demand is very elastic, it's the other way around, and the producers end up paying most of the tax, and the consumers see a very small price rise. Only in extreme cases of perfect elasticity or perfect inelasticity would we see one of those two groups paying the entire tax. Now, that's a specific tax because the shift is parallel. It's the same amount of tax. The vertical distance is the same. Whatever price we're looking at, there's always the same amount of tax. But I want to now show you ad valorem taxes. So, wait a minute. Find my board rubber. I want to now show you ad valorem taxes. So I'm just going to rub this out. Put in a new set of axes, and here is a supply curve, there is a demand curve, here is our equilibrium price, P1, here is our quantity, Q1, and an ad valorem tax is a tax which is not the same amount of money regardless of the price, it's the same percentage of the price. In fact, ad valorem taxes are far more common than specific taxes. A good example of ad valorem tax is VAT. I think in America that's called sales tax, isn't it? Or here in Greece, FIPIA. VAT in the UK, which is charged at 17.5% of the price. So clearly the VAT on a digital camera for £100 is going to be less than the VAT on a laptop computer for £1,000, even though it's the same percentage of the price. Well, how does that show up on the diagram? Well, it shows us a non-parallel shift, where the higher the price, the bigger the shift, because this shift is always the same percentage as that price. Let me say that again. The amount of shift is always the same percentage as the price. So as the price is higher, the shift is higher. Well, that said, everything else remains the same. We calculate the burden of tax between producers and consumers in exactly the same way. We go to the new equilibrium point. That will show us the new price and the new quantity. We go to the new equilibrium point and we see the vertical distance between the supply curves. Now, it's critical when you're doing this that you calculate this at the new equilibrium point, because if you pick any other point, the tax will be different. So, the new equilibrium point is here. The vertical distance between the two supply curves represents the tax per unit. It's that much. The price rise is paid by the consumers. The remainder must be being paid by the producers. And clearly in this case, where this is the entire tax revenue, the greater proportion of this tax is being paid by the consumers. That's because the demand curve is quite inelastic. I'm going to put some numbers on here and show you. Let's say that this is pounds and the old equilibrium price was 10. The new equilibrium price is 14. And let's say here we have 9, we can see, and let's say this quantity is 100, we can see that the entire tax revenue is, well, tax per unit is £5, the difference between 9 and 14, £5, and the number being sold is 100, so the entire tax is 500. But 400 is being paid by the consumers, price rise is 4, and the other 100 is being paid by the producers. So, to repeat it, whether it's ad valorem tax and a non-parallel shift, or whether it's a unit tax and a specific tax and there's a parallel shift, either way, you go to the new equilibrium point, the vertical distance between the supply curves is the tax per unit, and whatever out of that was a price rise, that's what the consumers pay. Remember, consumers pay the price rise. The rest is paid by the producers. And who pays the most of it? Well, that depends upon the elasticities. If demand is more inelastic than supply, the consumers pay most. If supply is more inelastic than demand, producers pay most. Okay?